The wind screamed through the canopy as Hauptmann Hans-Werner Lersch eased the control stick forward, watching the airspeed indicator climb past 430 miles per hour. The captured North American P-51 Mustang beneath him, coded T9+CK, in yellow and dark green German markings, responded to his touch with a smoothness that made his throat tight. It was June of 1944, and Lersch, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced test pilots, had flown more than 80 different aircraft types in his career at the Rechlin test facility. But this machine was different. This machine was making him understand why German fighter pilots over the Reich were dying. The morning had started with skepticism. When the American fighter had been towed onto the circular turf field at Rechlin 3 days earlier, Lersch had walked around it with the careful attention of a man examining a opponent's weapon. The P-51B had belonged to Lieutenant Thomas Fraser of the United States, Army Air Force's 4th Fighter Group. On the 6th of June, D-Day itself, Fraser had made an emergency landing near Cambrai in occupied France, setting the aircraft down intact in a field. The Germans could hardly believe their fortune. Here, sitting on German soil with barely a scratch, was the fighter that was systematically destroying the Luftwaffe over Europe. Lersch had studied the intelligence reports. Since late 1943, these silver Mustangs had been appearing in increasing numbers as bomber escorts. They could fly to Berlin and back. They could dogfight with Bf 109 seconds and Fu 190 seconds at any altitude. And most troubling of all, German pilots reported that the Mustangs seemed faster than they should be, faster than the performance figures the Luftwaffe had estimated. Now Lersch was going to find out why. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 2. Afternoon test flight was proceeding according to plan. Lersch had already completed the basic handling checks, takeoff performance, stall characteristics, control response. The Mustang flew beautifully. Its controls were light, almost delicate compared to the heavier German fighters he was accustomed to. The visibility from the bubble canopy was extraordinary, and the range, even on this test flight, the fuel gauges showed he could stay airborne for hours. But it was the speed that haunted him. At 18,000 feet, Lersch advanced the throttle to maximum continuous power and watched the manifold pressure gauge climb. The Packard-built Merlin engine, a license-produced version of the British Rolls-Royce power plant, roared at 3,000 revolutions per minute. The airspeed indicator continued its steady climb, 400 miles per hour, 410, 420. At this altitude, a standard Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 could manage perhaps 386 miles per hour. An FW 190A8 might reach 408. The Mustang was pulling away from them both, and Lersch hadn't even activated war emergency power. He keyed the radio, transmitting his observations to the engineers on the ground at Rechlin. Height, speed, engine temperature, manifold pressure, every number was being recorded. When he finally leveled off and began his descent back to the test facility, Lersch felt a cold certainty settling into his chest. This aircraft was good, very good, too good. But the real test was yet to come. The Rechlin facility sprawled across the landscape of Mecklenburg, roughly 100 kilometers northwest of Berlin. By mid-1944, it represented the heart of Luftwaffe aviation development and testing. The main airfield was unusual, a vast circular turf field, bounded by a hexagonal perimeter road, with no defined runways. Aircraft could take off and land in any direction the wind favored. Surrounding the field were laboratories, workshops, engine test cells, and housing for the engineers and test pilots who worked there. Rechlin had been Germany's primary aircraft testing center since the 1930s. Here, prototypes of every major Luftwaffe combat aircraft had been evaluated. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, the Focke-Wulf Fave 190, all had passed through Rechlin's systematic testing regime before entering production. The facility's test reports were considered the most reliable and objective performance data available. But by June of 1944, Rechlin had taken on an additional and increasingly urgent mission: evaluating captured Allied aircraft. As the air war intensified, more and more American and British aircraft were falling into German hands, some shot down and repairable, others making emergency landings on occupied territory. A special unit called Circus Rosarius, or Wonder Circus Rosarius, had been established to test these captured machines. The aircraft were repainted with German markings, their bellies and tail surfaces painted bright yellow for identification to prevent friendly fire, and assigned alphanumeric codes beginning with T9. The salvage and recovery operation itself was a massive undertaking. Specialized Luftwaffe recovery battalions, Bergbataillone, scoured occupied Europe for downed Allied aircraft. Speed was essential. Allied fighters routinely strafed their own crashed aircraft to prevent them from being recovered intact. Many potentially valuable specimens were destroyed by roving P-47 Thunderbolts or P-51 Mustangs before German crews could reach them. The aircraft that survived this gauntlet were transported to a repair center at Göttingen, where they were rebuilt using parts salvaged from multiple crash sites. By mid-war, Rechlin maintained stocks of captured Allied aviation fuel, lubricants, and even spare parts. The goal was to test enemy aircraft under conditions as close to operational as possible. When a B-17 Flying Fortress or a Mustang arrived at Rechlin, the engineers wanted to know exactly what the Americans could do, not what a captured aircraft flying on inadequate German substitutes might do. Hans Werner Lersch was the ideal man for this specialized work. Born in 1914, he had been drawn to aviation from childhood, building and flying model gliders, before progressing to full-sized sailplanes. His technical education and engineering background made him as much analyst as pilot. When he flew an aircraft, he didn't just feel how it handled, he understood why it handled that way. This combination of flying skill and technical knowledge had made him invaluable at Rechlin. By June of 1944, Lerche had already flown dozens of captured Allied types. He had tested a Supermarine Spitfire Mk2, noting its excellent turn performance, but criticizing its carburetor design that caused the engine to cut out under negative G-forces. He had flown captured B-17 Flying Fortresses, marveling at their exhaust-driven turbo superchargers that maintained power at high altitude. He had wrestled a B-26 Marauder into the air, nearly crashing during a hair-raising takeoff. Each aircraft taught him something about Allied design philosophy and capabilities. But the P-51 Mustang represented something different. This wasn't just another capable enemy fighter. This was the aircraft that was winning the air war over Germany. The strategic situation in June of 1944 was desperate for the Luftwaffe. Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy, had succeeded on the 6th of June. American and British forces were ashore in France, and the second front that Germany had dreaded was now reality. In the skies over the Reich, American heavy bombers B-17 Seconds and B-24 Liberators were attacking in formations of hundreds of aircraft, escorted by swarms of P-51 Mustangs, P-47 Thunderbolts, and P-38 Lightnings. The Mustang, in particular, had changed the nature of the air war. Before its arrival in late 1943, German fighters could engage American bomber formations, confident that the escorts would have to turn back at certain distances. The P-47 Seconds and P-38 Seconds had range, but not enough to escort bombers all the way to targets deep in Germany. But the P-51B could fly to Berlin and back with fuel to spare. It could dogfight with Bf 109 Seconds and FW 190 Seconds on equal or better terms. And increasingly, German pilots were reporting something else. The Mustangs seemed to have an advantage in power and speed that couldn't be explained by the airframe alone. Lerche had read these reports with professional interest. German intelligence had obtained reasonably accurate specifications for the P-51 wingspan, weight, armament, engine type. The Packard V-1650 was a license-built Rolls-Royce Merlin, an engine the Germans knew well from captured Spitfires. On paper, a Bf 109G or Fev 190A should have been competitive. In practice, German pilots were being shot down in alarming numbers. Now, with T9 plus CK sitting at Rechlin, Lerche and his engineering team had a chance to understand why. The test program for the captured Mustang was methodical and comprehensive. Over several weeks, Lerche and other test pilots would fly the aircraft repeatedly, measuring performance at different altitudes, speeds, and configurations. Every test flight generated pages of data speed versus altitude curves, rate of climb measurements, fuel consumption figures, handling characteristics, control forces. The Germans photographed every detail of the aircraft's construction, took apart its systems, and analyzed its design. Initially, the Mustang was tested with standard German aviation fuel. The Luftwaffe primarily used two grades: B4, a synthetic fuel produced from coal with an octane rating of around 87, and C3, a higher performance fuel with a rating of approximately 96 octane by German measurement standards. The C3 fuel was precious and scarce, produced in limited quantities through complex chemical processes. Most German fighters used it, but supplies were never adequate. The first test flights with German fuel were enlightening. The P-51B performed well as intelligence reports had suggested. It was fast, maneuverable, and had excellent range. At various altitudes, it matched or exceeded the performance of the Bf 109G and Fiev 190A. The engineers confirmed what pilots had reported. The Mustang was a formidable fighter, but something troubled Lerche. He had flown the Mustang hard, pushing it through maneuvers and high-speed dives. Yet he felt that the aircraft was not revealing its full potential. The engine ran smoothly, the controls responded crisply, but there was a sense impossible to quantify, purely instinctive that the machine could do more. The answer lay in a set of 55-gallon drums stored in a secure section of the Rechlin fuel depot. These drums contained captured American aviation gasoline, carefully preserved and analyzed by German chemists. The Americans called it 100-octane fuel, and later 100 over 130 grade, meaning 100 octane at lean mixture settings and 130 performance number at rich mixture. By mid-1944, the most advanced American fighters were beginning to use an even more potent formula, 100 over 150 grade fuel. The Germans understood octane ratings. They understood that higher octane fuel allowed an engine to tolerate higher compression ratios and higher manifold pressures without detonating the destructive engine knock that could blow holes in pistons. What they didn't fully appreciate was the magnitude of the advantage that American fuel technology provided. Germany's synthetic fuel industry was a marvel of chemistry and engineering. Through the Burgess process and Fischer-Tropsch synthesis, German chemists could convert coal into liquid fuels. The nation had abundant coal reserves, which made this technology strategically vital when access to petroleum sources became limited. The synthetic gasoline produced was actually quite pure, lower in sulfur and other contaminants than petroleum-derived fuels. But there was a problem. Producing high-octane fuel required additional processing steps, reforming, cracking, and the addition of costly chemical compounds like tetraethyl lead and aromatic hydrocarbons. Each increase in octane rating reduced the total volume of fuel that could be produced from a given amount of coal. Germany faced a cruel calculation. They could produce more fuel of moderate quality or less fuel of higher quality. With fuel supplies already constrained by Allied bombing of synthetic fuel plants and the loss of Romanian oil fields, the Germans had limited room for choice. American industry faced no such constraints. The United States had vast petroleum reserves and had invested heavily in catalytic cracking technology. Plants across the American oil belt could produce high-octane aviation fuel in enormous quantities. More importantly, American chemists had perfected the production of tetraethyl lead and other octane-boosting additives. By 1944, American refineries were producing fuel that German engineers could barely imagine making in meaningful quantities. The difference was more than academic. Octane rating directly affected what an aircraft engine could do. Higher octane fuel allowed pilots to use war emergency power, temporary boost settings that increased manifold pressure far beyond normal limits. For a few critical minutes during combat, this could mean the difference between catching an enemy or being caught, between shooting down a bomber or being shot down by its escorts. On a morning in mid-June, the engineers at Rechlin prepared T9 plus CK for a different kind of test flight. The German fuel was drained from the Mustang's tanks. Carefully, methodically, mechanics filled the Kellic aircraft with American 100 over 130 octane fuel from the captured stock. The fuel had a distinctive green color from the dye added for identification. As it flowed into the wing tanks, the chemical difference between this fuel and the German B4 or C3 was invisible to the naked eye. But at the molecular level, it represented a gulf in industrial capability. Lerche climbed into the cockpit, ran through the pre-flight checks, and started the Packard Merlin engine. Everything seemed normal. The engine caught, settled into a steady rumble. Gauges showed normal readings. He taxied to the edge of the circular field and turned into the wind. The takeoff felt different immediately. As Lerche advanced the throttle, the engine responded with a surge of power that seemed sharper, more eager than before. The Mustang accelerated down the grass field and lifted off smoothly. As he climbed away from Rechlin, gaining altitude over the Mecklenburg countryside, Lerche began to understand that he was experiencing something significant. At 5,000 feet, he leveled off and began the first speed runs. The airspeed indicator climbed steadily faster than it had in previous tests with German fuel. At 10,000 feet, the difference was more pronounced. The same throttle settings were producing noticeably higher speeds, and the engine felt different. It ran smoother, pulled harder, seemed to relish the higher manifold pressures. Lurch climbed higher, to 15,000 feet, then 20,000. At each altitude, he flew precisely measured speed runs, while engineers on the ground tracked him by radio and visual observation. When he finally descended and landed back at Rechlin, taxiing the yellow-marked Mustang back to the test area, he knew that everything had changed. The data was undeniable. With American fuel, the P-51B was 10 to 15 miles per hour faster at every altitude. Rate of climb improved by hundreds of feet per minute. The engine could be pushed, harder, longer, with less risk of detonation damage. The Americans weren't just flying better aircraft, they were flying the same aircraft significantly better than German fuel could enable. The engineering team gathered to analyze the results. They ran calculations, compared performance curves, studied fuel consumption data. The conclusion emerged slowly, reluctantly, but with absolute clarity. The P-51 Mustang's superiority came not primarily from its excellent airframe design or even its powerful Merlin engine, but from the fuel that made the engine achieve its full potential. One of the engineers made a grim observation. If they put American fuel in a Bf 109G or Fair AW 190A, those German fighters would also perform better, perhaps 15 to 20% improvement in power output. But Germany couldn't make that fuel, not in the quantities needed. Not while Allied bombers were systematically destroying synthetic fuel plants across the Reich. Not while the chemical industry struggled to produce enough octane-boosting additives. The Americans could put their best fuel in every fighter, every bomber, every training aircraft. The Germans could not. This single fact, this invisible difference in the chemical composition of gasoline, represented a strategic advantage that no amount of pilot skill, tactical genius, or engineering cleverness could overcome. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. In the weeks that followed, additional captured P-51 seconds arrived at Rechlin for testing. Some were P-51Bs like Fraser's aircraft. Others were the newer P-51D model with its distinctive bubble canopy and 650 caliber machine guns. Each one underwent the same systematic evaluation. Each one confirmed the same devastating truth. Lörsch flew several of these Mustangs. In his later memoir, a book titled Luftwaffe Test Pilot, Flying Captured Allied Aircraft of Dutch World War II, published in 1980, he would reflect on the experience with careful professionalism. He acknowledged the P-51's excellence as a fighting machine. He praised its aerodynamic design, its range, its pleasant handling characteristics. He noted that the cockpit was more complex than German fighters, with more controls and switches to manage. But he also understood, with the clarity that only direct experience could provide, that the Mustang represented more than engineering achievement. It represented industrial and scientific depth. The Americans could not only design excellent aircraft, they could power them with fuel that extracted every ounce of capability from those designs. And they could do it for thousands of aircraft simultaneously. Other captured Allied aircraft told the same story. When Rechlin tested captured Republic P-47 Thunderbolt's massive, powerful fighters with turbocharged engines, the performance on American fuel was startling. The P-47D could reach speeds exceeding 430 miles per hour and fight effectively above 30,000 feet. German pilots called it the Jug for its portly appearance, but they learned to respect its diving speed and devastating firepower. A captured Hawker Tempest, one of the latest British fighters, also impressed the German test pilots. Fast, powerful, and dangerous, it represented the evolution of British design philosophy. And like the American fighters, it ran on high-octane fuel that enabled performance German aircraft couldn't match. Soviet fighters captured on the Eastern Front presented a different picture. The Yakovlev Yak-3 and Lavochkin La-5 were excellent dogfighters, light, agile, and well-suited to low-altitude combat. But Soviet fuel quality was inconsistent, and these aircraft didn't have the high-altitude performance or the raw power that American fuel technology enabled. The pattern was clear. In the hierarchy of fuel technology, the Americans led, the British followed closely, the Germans struggled to keep pace, and the Soviets and Japanese lagged further behind. This hierarchy correlated directly with strategic bombing effectiveness, fighter performance, and ultimately, control of the air. By late 1944, German aviation fuel production was in crisis. Allied strategic bombing campaigns had targeted synthetic fuel plants with increasing intensity. Major facilities at Leuna, Politz, Brooks, and other locations had been hit repeatedly by American B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds, flying in massive daylight formations, and by British Lancasters and Halifaxes attacking at night. German industry was resilient, plants were repaired, production was dispersed, underground facilities were constructed, but the cumulative damage was severe. Fuel production statistics told a story of industrial collapse. In May of 1944, Germany produced approximately 316,000 tons of aviation fuel. By September, after intensive Allied bombing, production had fallen to just 17,000 tons, a catastrophic 94% reduction. Luftwaffe units across Europe faced fuel shortages so severe that training flights were curtailed, combat operations were limited, and newly produced aircraft sat on airfields unable to fly. The strategic bombing campaign against oil targets, what later analysts would call the oil campaign, was perhaps the single most effective element of the Allied air offensive against Germany. It didn't produce the dramatic visible destruction of city attacks, but it strangled the Wehrmacht's ability to move, the Luftwaffe's ability to fly, and the German war economy's ability to function. At Rechlin, the engineers studying the captured Mustangs understood these larger strategic realities. Their test reports were models of objectivity and technical precision. They documented speeds, altitudes, fuel consumption rates, and handling characteristics with Germanic thoroughness. The reports noted that captured American fuel stocks allowed for more realistic testing, and that performance with this fuel exceeded performance with German equivalents. But the reports also contained an undercurrent of resignation. The engineers could measure the advantage. They could quantify it in miles per hour, in manifold pressure readings, in rate of climb figures. What they couldn't do was eliminate it. Germany lacked the petroleum feedstock, the refining capacity, the chemical industry depth, and by late 1944, the time to match American fuel technology. The fuel disparity manifested in countless small ways that accumulated into strategic significance. American pilots could use war emergency power settings for 5 minutes during combat, enough time to chase down an enemy, execute an attack, and escape. German pilots had similar emergency power options using systems like MW-50 water methanol injection, but the boost was less, and the complexity of the systems made them maintenance intensive. American engines could tolerate higher boost pressures without detonation. The Packard-built Merlin engines in the P-51 could run at manifold pressures of 61 to 67 inches of mercury, more than twice atmospheric pressure, when using high-octane fuel and war emergency. Power. German engines running on C3 fuel could approach these pressures only with supplemental injection systems. And even then, the margins were tighter, the risks greater. The Americans could afford to be profligate with high-performance fuel. Training aircraft in the United States often used the same high-octane fuel as combat aircraft. There was enough production capacity to fuel not only fighters and bombers, but also the massive training establishment that produced tens of thousands of new pilots annually. Germany hoarded its limited stocks of C3 fuel for frontline fighters, while training aircraft made do with lower grades. The British had achieved similar fuel technology, though their path had been different. In 1940, during the Battle of Britain, the Royal Air Force had transitioned from 87-octane fuel to 100-octane fuel supplied by American refineries. The improvement in Spitfire and Hurricane performance had been dramatic speed increases of 30 to 40 miles per hour, rate of climb improvements of 500 to 1,000 feet per minute. German pilots who had dominated the skies over France in May of 1940 found themselves fighting improved British fighters in August and September. The fuel advantage hadn't been decisive by itself, but it had helped tip the balance. By 1944, British and American aircraft in Europe increasingly used 100 over 150 grade fuel, the same fuel that had transformed the captured P-51's performance at Rechlin. This fuel grade had been developed through collaborative work between British and American chemists. It used sophisticated blends of aromatics, alkylates, and tetraethyl, lead to achieve performance numbers that pushed the boundaries of piston engine technology. The designation itself told the story. 100 octane at lean mixture settings, 150 performance number at rich mixture settings. The performance number scale extended beyond the octane scale, which ended at 100. A performance number of 150 meant the fuel could resist detonation 50% better than pure iso-octane under rich mixture conditions. This allowed engines to extract enormous power for short bursts, the kind of power needed to catch an enemy fighter or escape from danger. German chemists understood the theory. They had experimented with similar formulations. Late-war C3 fuel achieved performance approaching 100 over 130 grade in some batches, particularly those using iso-octane additives. But producing iso-octane required butene, which was also needed for synthetic rubber production. German industry faced constant trade-offs: fuel versus rubber, explosives versus fertilizers, steel versus aluminum. Every resource choice had cascading consequences. The Americans faced no such constraints. American industrial capacity in 1944 was staggering. The United States produced more than 96,000 aircraft that year, more than Germany, Britain, Japan, and the Soviet Union combined. American shipyards launched more tonnage in a single year than Germany had built in the entire war. American agriculture produced food surpluses that fed Allied armies worldwide. And American refineries produced high-octane fuel in quantities that would have seemed fantastical to German planners. Jimmy Doolittle, the famous pilot who had led the Tokyo raid in 1942 and who now commanded the 8th Air Force, had been instrumental in developing high-octane fuel technology years before the war. Working for Shell Oil in the 1930s, Doolittle had advocated for higher-octane aviation fuels, understanding that they would enable a revolution in aircraft performance. His million-dollar blunder, as skeptical Shell executives had called the high-octane development program, had proven to be one of the most consequential investments in aviation history. The catalytic cracking processes developed by Eugene Houdry and others in the late 1930s had made mass production of high-octane fuel economically feasible. The technology spread across the American oil industry. By 1944, refineries from Texas to California to Pennsylvania were producing tens of millions of gallons of high-octane aviation fuel monthly. Storage, distribution, and quality control were equally impressive. American fuel reached England in tanker ships, was stored in dispersed depots, and was delivered to airbases with careful quality assurance. Color coding systems prevented mix-ups: green for 100/130 grade, purple for the even higher grades. Fuel. Samples were regularly tested to ensure they met specifications. The entire system operated with industrial efficiency. Germany's fuel situation, by contrast, was increasingly desperate. The bombing campaign had destroyed not just production capacity, but also the supporting infrastructure: pipelines, storage facilities, rail connections. Allied intelligence, aided by ultra-decrypts of German communications and aerial reconnaissance, could track fuel shortages almost in real time. When German fighters appeared in smaller numbers or with less aggressive tactics, Allied analysts knew it reflected fuel scarcity rather than German strategic choice. The human cost of the fuel disparity was measured in pilot casualties. German fighter pilots in late 1944 faced opponents with every advantage: numerical superiority, better fuel, often better aircraft, and increasingly, the confidence that comes from sustained success. Luftwaffe losses mounted. Experienced pilots died or were wounded at a rate training could never replace. Inexperienced replacements arrived at combat units with minimal flying hours, sometimes less than 100 hours total time, because fuel shortages had curtailed advanced training. At Rechlin, Lörsch and his colleagues continued their work through the summer and autumn of 1944, even as Allied bombing threatened the facility itself. In April of 1945, American heavy bombers, B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds from the 8th Air Force, attacked Rechlin with devastating effect. The circular test field was cratered, buildings were destroyed, and much equipment was lost. What remained was blown up by German forces before Soviet troops arrived on the 2nd of May. By then, Lörsch had already evacuated, flying a Dornier Do 335, one of Germany's last advanced piston-engined fighters, to Allied-controlled territory in the war's final days. He survived the war and later emigrated to the United States, where his expertise in test flying found new application in the Cold War aviation industry. The captured P-51B that Lörsch had flown, T-9+CK, had a different fate. Records suggest it remained at Rechlin, or one of its satellite fields, until the facility's destruction. Whether it was destroyed in bombing, deliberately demolished by retreating Germans, or captured intact by Soviet forces remains unclear. Like so many artifacts of that desperate period, its physical trace disappeared into the chaos of Germany's collapse. But the lessons learned from testing that aircraft and the dozens of other captured Allied machines evaluated at Rechlin survived in technical reports, in pilot debriefings, in the memories of those who had participated. German engineers had confirmed what their pilots already knew from combat. They were fighting an enemy with not just numerical superiority, but technological and industrial advantages they could not match. The fuel revelation carried implications beyond the immediate, tactical situation. It illuminated a fundamental truth about modern industrial warfare. Wars are won not just by soldiers or even by generals, but by scientists, engineers, and industrial workers whose contributions never appear in combat reports, but whose work determines what is possible on the battlefield. Consider the chain of causation. American chemists develop high-octane fuel. This enables aircraft engines to produce more power. This translates to faster, higher-flying fighters. These fighters escort bombers deep into Germany. The bombers destroy German industrial capacity, including fuel production. This forces German fighters to operate with inferior fuel. Their reduced performance makes them more vulnerable to the high-octane fueled Allied fighters. The cycle reinforces itself. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe's situation was catastrophic. Fuel shortages were so severe that fighters often couldn't respond to Allied bomber raids, even when aircraft and pilots were available. The introduction of jet fighters, the Messerschmitt Me 262 and Arado R 234, offered hope of technological leapfrogging, but jets required different fuel, kerosene-based J2, and came too late in too small numbers to affect the outcome. The strategic bombing survey conducted by Allied investigators after Germany's surrender documented the fuel crisis in detail. German aviation fuel production had been 663,000 tons in March of 1944. By March of 1945, it was effectively zero. The entire aviation fuel production infrastructure had been destroyed or captured. German forces in the war's final battles operated with whatever stocks remained, hoarded like gold, use drop by precious drop. Japanese aviation faced similar fuel problems, though from different causes. Japan had no domestic petroleum and limited coal. The nation had depended on oil imports from the Dutch East Indies and other conquered territories. American submarines systematically destroyed Japanese tankers, strangling fuel supplies to the home islands. Japanese aviation fuel quality declined throughout the war, where Japanese fighters had started the war using 87 to 91 octane fuel. By 1945, they were sometimes using fuel of 70 or 80 octane, barely adequate for automobiles, let alone high-performance aircraft engines. The Soviet Union's fuel situation fell between the German and Japanese extremes and the American-British abundance. Soviet refineries produced adequate quantities of fuel, aided by American deliveries under Lend-Lease, but quality remained inconsistent. Soviet fighters generally used fuel in the 87 to 95 octane range. This was sufficient for the low-altitude, close support missions that characterized much Eastern Front combat, but it limited high-altitude performance. The Americans, meanwhile, pushed fuel technology even further. By 1945, experimental batches of fuel reached performance numbers of 150 and above. Late-model P-51 HS, the fastest production Mustang variant, could exceed 487 miles per hour using this fuel. The Grumman F-8F Bearcat, designed as a lightweight interceptor, achieved similar speeds. Even these advances came late in the war, but they indicated the trajectory of American chemical engineering. Post-war analysis by American technical intelligence teams examined German fuel technology thoroughly. Teams of investigators visited captured synthetic fuel plants, interviewed German chemists and engineers, and studied production records. Their reports, classified at the time but later declassified, painted a picture of an industry that had achieved remarkable things with inadequate resources, but ultimately couldn't compete with Allied industrial might. One report, Technical Report 145-45, titled Manufacture of Aviation Gasoline in Germany, noted that late-war German fuel quality was actually quite sophisticated in some respects. The use of aromatics and specialized additives had produced fuel that performed better than its octane rating suggested. Under certain conditions, German C3 fuel approached the anti-knock properties of Allied 100/130 grade. But the report also noted that this achievement came at enormous cost. The complex chemical processes required to produce C3 fuel were vulnerable to disruption. Loss of a single critical facility could cripple production. Allied bombing had exploited these vulnerabilities systematically. The report's conclusion was stark. Germany had the scientific knowledge to produce high-performance fuel, but lacked the industrial capacity and raw materials to do so in militarily significant quantities once the bombing campaign intensified. The strategic implications extended into the post-war period. American and Soviet forces raced to capture German scientists, engineers, and technical documentation. The expertise gained in synthetic fuel production from coal would later inform American research programs, though abundant petroleum made such technology less urgent for the United States than it had been for Germany. For aviation historians and engineers studying the war decades later, the fuel factor emerged as one of the less visible but more significant aspects of Allied victory. Popular histories focused on dramatic air battles, ace pilots, and sleek aircraft designs. These were indeed important, but underlying all of it was industrial and chemical engineering that made superior performance possible. The story of the Germans flying a captured P-51 Mustang and discovering the fuel advantage became part of this historical understanding. It wasn't that German engineers were incompetent. Rechlin's test reports were rigorous and honest. It wasn't that German pilots lacked skill. Many were among the most experienced and capable aviators of the war. The problem was systemic and strategic. Germany couldn't produce what it needed in the quantities required, and Allied bombing ensured that existing production couldn't be sustained. Lurch's memoir, published decades after the war, provided valuable first-hand perspective on the testing program. His accounts of flying captured Allied aircraft were detailed and professional, free from propaganda or bitterness. He described the P-51 Mustang with respect, acknowledging its excellence while noting specific characteristics that a test pilot would observe: control forces, visibility, cockpit layout, engine response. What came through in Lurch's writing was a sense of professionalism transcending national loyalty. He was an engineer and aviator evaluating machines, recording data, seeking to understand. That the machines happened to belong to the enemy was almost secondary. His job was to fly them, measure their capabilities, and report honestly what he found. That honesty extended to acknowledging their superiority in many respects. Other Luftwaffe test pilots who flew captured Allied aircraft reported similar impressions. The consensus was that American fighters were excellent machines, well designed, robustly built, and devastatingly effective when properly fueled and maintained. British fighters were praised for their handling qualities and high-altitude performance. Soviet fighters earned respect for their ruggedness and suitability to Eastern Front conditions. But running through all these evaluations was the recognition that Allied aviation operated from a foundation of industrial and technical superiority that Germany couldn't match. It wasn't any single factor, it was the accumulation of advantages in fuel, in production capacity, in pilot training systems, in maintenance and logistics, in the sheer scale of operations. The P-51 Mustang became symbolic of this disparity. Here was an aircraft that combined British aerodynamic design, the Mustang's airframe, British engine, technology, the Rolls-Royce Merlin, American production efficiency, North American aviation built them by the thousands, and American fuel chemistry, the high-octane fuel that made the engine reach its potential. It represented the Allied coalition's combined strengths. By war's end, over 15,000 P-51 Mustangs had been built. They equipped fighter groups across Europe and the Pacific. They flew top cover for bombers, strafed ground targets, escorted photo reconnaissance missions, and engaged enemy fighters wherever they appeared. They became synonymous with American air power. The 8th Air Force's 4th Fighter Group, the unit that Lieutenant Fraser had belonged to when his P-51B was captured, became the top-scoring American fighter group in Europe, with over 1,000 enemy aircraft destroyed. Much of that success came while flying Mustangs. Other units achieved similarly impressive records. German pilots learned to respect the Mustang, though they sometimes found ways to exploit its vulnerabilities. The P-51's liquid-cooled engine was susceptible to damage. A single hit in the cooling system could force an emergency landing. German pilots tried to target the vulnerable radiator beneath the fuselage, but more often, the Mustang's speed, range, and numerical advantage overwhelmed defensive tactics. The post-war world saw P-51 Mustangs continue in service for years. The US Air Force used them in the Korean War. Smaller nations operated them into the 1950s and 60s. Racing enthusiasts bought surplus Mustangs and modified them for air racing, where they set speed records that stood for decades. Today, surviving P-51 seconds are prized warbirds, maintained by collectors and flying museums, reminders of a technological and industrial achievement. The broader lesson about fuel technology influenced post-war military thinking. The development of jet engines, which used kerosene-based fuels rather than high-octane gasoline, partially shifted the terms of the technological competition. But the underlying principle remained. In modern warfare, victory goes to nations that can not only design advanced weapons, but also produce the materials and systems that make those weapons effective. The Germans' testing of captured Allied aircraft at Rechlin represented a last attempt to understand what they were up against. By mid-1944, the data gathered could inform defensive tactics but couldn't change the strategic situation. The test reports documented Allied superiority with scientific precision, but knowledge alone couldn't produce the fuel, raw materials, and industrial capacity that Germany lacked. In the war's final months, as the Reich collapsed, Rechlin's role diminished. Allied bombers had destroyed much of the facility. Soviet forces, advancing from the east, threatened to overrun the area. German jet fighters, the Me-262 seconds, and others, represented the technological future, but that future had arrived too late. The piston-engined fighters that Rechlin had tested and evaluated were being swept from the skies by overwhelming Allied numbers and industrial power. When Soviet troops captured Rechlin in early May of 1945, they found the remains of Germany's premier aviation test facility. Cratered airfields, destroyed buildings, wrecked aircraft. Some equipment and personnel had been evacuated westward. Much had been destroyed to prevent capture. The Soviets salvaged what they could, including technical documents and any surviving aircraft and equipment. The knowledge gained from testing captured Allied aircraft became part of the technical intelligence that shaped post-war aviation development on both sides. American and British teams interrogated German engineers, studied captured German aircraft and equipment, and incorporated useful innovations into their own programs. Soviet teams did the same from their occupation zone. The war's technological competition continued in different form during the Cold War. For the pilots who had flown both Allied and German fighters, men like Hans-Werner Lersch, the experience provided unique perspective. They understood the strengths and weaknesses of different design philosophies. They had felt the difference that fuel quality made. They knew that warfare was ultimately about systems, not just individual machines or pilots. Lersch's later career in the United States brought interesting circularity. The German test pilot who had flown captured American aircraft during the war now worked for American aviation companies in peacetime. His expertise, like that of many German engineers and scientists, was valued by former enemies who recognized talent regardless of nationality. The legacy of the fuel disparity extended into energy policy and industrial strategy. Nations that aspired to military power recognized that petroleum access and refining capacity were strategic necessities. The Middle East's importance as an oil-producing region became central to Cold War geopolitics, partly because of lessons learned about fuel's military importance in World War II. Aviation fuel technology continued evolving after the war, though the trajectory shifted. Jet engines reduced the importance of octane ratings. Jets used essentially kerosene, not gasoline. But turbojet and turbofan engines brought their own fuel chemistry challenges. The principle remained: better fuel chemistry enabled better engine performance. For students of World War II, the story of German test pilots flying captured P-51 Mustangs and discovering the fuel advantage illustrates how warfare operates on multiple levels simultaneously. There were the visible battles, fighters dogfighting over Germany, bombers attacking cities and factories, armies clashing on the ground. But beneath these visible contests lay invisible ones: chemists competing to produce better fuel, engineers designing more efficient engines, industrial managers optimizing production. The Germans lost these invisible battles as surely as they lost the visible ones. They lacked the resources, the access to raw materials, the industrial depth, and ultimately the time to match Allied capabilities. The test reports from Rechlin documented this reality with painful clarity. In retrospect, the fuel disparity was part of a larger pattern. Germany and Japan challenged opponents with far greater industrial and demographic resources. They achieved remarkable things: advanced technology, skilled soldiers, tactical innovations, but ultimately couldn't overcome fundamental resource disadvantages. Once those opponents mobilized their full potential, the outcome became increasingly inevitable. The P-51 Mustang, flying on 150-grade fuel, represented that mobilized potential. It wasn't just an excellent aircraft, it was an excellent aircraft powered by fuel that Germany couldn't produce, built in factories that Germany couldn't match, piloted by men trained in a system that Germany couldn't sustain, and supported by logistics that Germany couldn't replicate. When Lerche pushed that Mustang to 490 miles per hour during testing, exceeding the performance achievable with German fuel, he was measuring more than aircraft specifications. He was measuring the gap between Allied and German industrial capability. He was documenting, with scientific precision, one of the reasons Germany was losing the air war. The data went into reports. The reports informed tactical decisions and strategic assessments, but by mid-1944, no report could change the fundamental situation. Germany was fighting a war it could no longer win, against enemies it could no longer match, with resources it no longer had. The fuel revelation at Rechlin was just one of many such revelations during the war's final year. German intelligence officers studying Allied equipment found similar disparities in electronics, in metallurgy, in precision manufacturing. Each disparity told the same story. Germany had fallen behind in the industrial competition that ultimately determined military outcomes. For the men who fought in the air over Europe, German pilots in their Bf 109 seconds and FW 190 seconds, American pilots in their P-51 seconds and P-47 seconds, British pilots in their Spitfires and Typhoons, these industrial and chemical factors were distant abstractions. What mattered was the immediate: can I catch that enemy fighter? Will my engine give me the power I need? Do I have enough fuel to get home? But those immediate tactical concerns were shaped by the distant industrial factors. The American pilot could push his engine harder because better fuel allowed it. The German pilot had to conserve fuel because shortages limited operations. These small differences, multiplied across thousands of sorties, determined who controlled the sky. By the spring of 1945, Allied air superiority over Germany was absolute. Luftwaffe fighters rarely appeared in significant numbers. Those that did were quickly overwhelmed. The Americans and British bombed targets almost at will. The war's outcome was no longer in doubt. Germany's synthetic fuel industry, once viewed as a triumph of chemistry and engineering, lay in ruins. The plants at Leuna, Politz, and elsewhere were heaps of twisted metal and broken concrete. Romanian oil fields that had supplied Germany early in the war were in Soviet hands. The fuel that remained was hoarded for the army's last desperate operations and for the handful of jets that could still fly. The P-51 Mustangs that had helped achieve this air superiority continued flying combat missions until the final days. They strafed German airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground. They provided top cover for reconnaissance flights over the shrinking Reich. They flew patrols over concentration camps as Allied ground forces advanced. When Germany surrendered on the 8th of May, 1945, thousands of P-51 seconds were still in service across Europe and the Pacific. They had proven to be one of the war's most successful fighter aircraft, perhaps the most successful. Their combination of range, performance, and reliability had made them indispensable to the strategic bombing campaign. The captured P-51 that Lerche had tested at Rechlin T9+CK was lost to history, probably destroyed in the facility's final days. But the lessons learned from testing it survived. They informed German understanding of Allied capabilities. They validated what combat experience had already suggested. the Allies possessed advantages that extended far beyond the cockpit. For historians analysing World War II decades later, the fuel factor emerged as a crucial but often underappreciated element of Allied victory. It wasn't as dramatic as D-Day or as memorable as specific air battles, but it was fundamental. Without high-octane fuel, Allied aircraft couldn't have performed as they did. Without the industrial capacity to produce that fuel in massive quantities, tactical advantages couldn't have been sustained. The Germans' discovery of the fuel disparity through testing captured aircraft was thus both revelation and confirmation. It revealed the specific magnitude of the advantage 10 to 15 miles per hour faster, hundreds of feet per minute better climb rate, higher operational ceiling. But it confirmed what was already becoming tragically apparent. Germany was fighting a war against enemies with overwhelming material superiority. That superiority didn't guarantee victory in every engagement. Skilled German pilots continued scoring victories throughout the war, but it shifted the odds in every engagement. Over time, over thousands of sorties, those shifted odds accumulated into strategic dominance. The story of Germans flying a P-51 at high speed and then admitting that fuel technology made it unbeatable thus encapsulates a larger truth about World War II. It was decided not just by soldiers and battles, but by factories and laboratories, by chemists and engineers, by the accumulated weight of industrial and technological capability. For the men who flew and fought, for the engineers who tested and analyzed, for the chemists who formulated fuels and the workers who produced them, the war was an all-consuming present. Only in retrospect did the patterns become clear. The lessons emerge. The full significance of decisions and developments become apparent. The P-51 Mustang, powered by high-octane American fuel, became an emblem of Allied air power, not just because it was well-designed or fast or long-ranged, but because it represented a system that worked. Design, production, fuel, training, logistics, all functioning together at a scale Germany couldn't match. When the war ended, roughly 175 P-51 Mustangs survived into private ownership. Today, they fly at air shows and races, living monuments to the men who flew them and the era that produced them. Each time one of these restored Mustangs roars past with its Packard Merlin engine at full power, it's worth remembering. That sound, that speed, that capability depended on more than aluminum and rivets. It depended on chemistry, on industrial capacity, on the invisible infrastructure that made victory possible. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.